The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Buckingham Palace as tourists began gathering for the daily changing of the guard ceremony. Among the crowd stood James Mitchell, a 28-year-old royal guard with 5 years of dedicated service to the crown. His red tunic was perfectly pressed, his bearskin hat positioned with military precision, and his rifle held at exactly the right angle. James had seen it all during his time on duty. Respectful visitors who maintained proper distance, excited children waving from behind the barriers, and photographers capturing the pageantry from appropriate spots. But lately, something had changed. Social media had transformed the sacred ceremony into a backdrop for viral content, and tourists were becoming increasingly bold in their attempts to get the perfect shot. On this particular Tuesday morning, James noticed a group of young tourists armed with selfie sticks and cameras, speaking loudly in American accents. They were already testing boundaries, stepping closer to the guards than protocol allowed. The leader of the group, a blonde woman in her early 20s wearing a bright pink jacket, seemed particularly determined to get attention. As James took his position outside the palace gates, he could feel the familiar weight of responsibility on his shoulders. The royal guards weren't just ceremonial figures. They were active soldiers tasked with protecting one of the most important buildings in Britain. Every day they balanced the need to maintain dignity and discipline with the reality of dealing with hundreds of tourists who didn't always understand the significance of their role. The crowd grew larger as the ceremony time approached. James remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed straight ahead, following the strict protocol that had been drilled into him during training. He had learned to ignore distractions, to stand motionless for hours, and to maintain his composure no matter what happened around him. But the group of American tourists was becoming more persistent. They had moved from taking photos at a respectful distance to gradually inching closer, testing how far they could push before someone stopped them. The blonde woman was now pointing directly at James, making jokes to her friends about getting him to react. James's training had prepared him for this. Royal guards were expected to remain completely motionless and silent while on duty, regardless of what tourists did around them. They were living statues, symbols of British tradition and military excellence. Breaking character was not an option, no matter how inappropriate or disruptive visitors became. The woman in pink stepped even closer, now just a few feet from James's position. She was speaking loudly, trying to get his attention, making faces, and gesturing wildly for her friends to record everything. Other tourists in the area began to notice the commotion, some looking uncomfortable with the group's behavior, others pulling out their phones to capture whatever might happen next. James could see everything happening in his peripheral vision, but his face remained expressionless. His breathing stayed steady, his posture unchanged. Years of training had taught him that maintaining dignity in the face of disrespect was part of his duty. The Royal Guard uniform he wore represented centuries of tradition, and he would not allow anyone to diminish that significance. The morning air was crisp and tourists continued to arrive, creating a larger audience for what was about to unfold. James had no way of knowing that this particular encounter would soon be viewed by millions of people around the world, or that his response would become a perfect example of professional military bearing under pressure. As the blonde tourist continued her attempts to get a reaction, James remained focused on his duty. He had sworn an oath to serve and protect, and that oath extended to maintaining the honor and dignity of his position. Whatever happened next, he would handle it with the same discipline and professionalism that had defined the Royal Guards for generations. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test everything James had learned about duty, respect, and the proper way to handle people who refused to understand the boundaries of appropriate behavior around one of Britain's most sacred institutions. The blonde tourist, emboldened by James's lack of response, decided to escalate her behavior. She pulled out her phone and began taking selfies while standing directly next to him, her bright pink jacket a stark contrast against his traditional red uniform. Her friends cheered her on, recording everything and shouting suggestions for more outrageous poses. "Come on, smile for the camera," she called out to James, waving her hand in front of his face. When he didn't react, she moved even closer, now standing within arm's reach of his position. The crowd around them grew larger as word spread through the tourist groups that someone was creating a scene with the royal guard. James could feel his jaw tighten slightly, but his face remained perfectly composed. His training had covered scenarios like this extensively. Royal guards were taught to treat their posts as sacred ground, and allowing tourists to make a mockery of their duty was never acceptable. However, they were also instructed to use measured responses and to never act out of anger or frustration. The woman's behavior became increasingly inappropriate. She began making exaggerated military poses next to James, saluting dramatically while her friends laughed and recorded. She even went so far as to lean against him slightly, treating him like a statue in a wax museum, rather than a serving soldier protecting an important government building. Other tourists in the crowd began to express their disapproval. Several British visitors could be heard muttering about the lack of respect being shown, and some started taking their own videos, clearly disturbed by what they were witnessing. An elderly gentleman in a veteran's cap shook his head in disgust, while a family with young children moved away from the area, not wanting their kids to see such disrespectful behavior. The blonde tourist noticed the growing attention and seemed to feed off it. She began speaking even louder, making jokes about British culture and military traditions. Her comments were not only disrespectful but also demonstrated a complete misunderstanding of the role and importance of the royal guards. She treated the entire situation as entertainment, completely ignoring the fact that she was interfering with an active military duty. James's peripheral vision allowed him to see everything happening around him. He noticed the uncomfortable expressions on many faces in the crowd, the way children were staring in confusion, and the obvious anger building among several British visitors. He also saw something else. A small group of palace security personnel had begun moving through the crowd, alerted by the commotion. The woman's friends were now encouraging her to be even more outrageous. They suggested she try to get the guard to speak, to move, or to break his serious expression in some way. One of them even suggested she should try to touch his rifle, a comment that made several nearby tourists gasp in shock. James knew that his moment was coming. Royal guards had specific protocols for dealing with tourists who crossed certain lines, and this group was rapidly approaching those boundaries. He had been trained to give warnings before taking action, but those warnings were delivered in a very particular way that left no doubt about their seriousness. The security personnel were now positioned strategically around the area, ready to intervene if necessary. They had been monitoring the situation and were prepared to escort the disruptive tourists away from the palace grounds if they continued their inappropriate behavior. Meanwhile, the blonde woman decided to take things one step further. She reached out toward James's rifle, not quite touching it but coming close enough that her intentions were clear. This action crossed a critical line that no tourist was ever supposed to approach. Royal Guards' weapons were not props for photo opportunities, and any attempt to touch or interfere with them was considered a serious security threat. James could sense the shift in the crowd's energy. The playful atmosphere had turned tense, and even the woman's friends seemed to realize that things had gone too far. But the blonde tourist, caught up in her quest for social media fame, appeared completely unaware of the gravity of her actions. The moment had arrived for James to demonstrate exactly why Royal Guards were trained professionals, not decorative figures. His response would need to be swift, clear, and unmistakably authoritative while still maintaining the dignity and discipline that his position demanded. Without any warning, James suddenly came to life with military precision that made everyone around him jump. His rifle moved in one fluid motion from its ceremonial position to a ready stance, and his voice boomed across the courtyard with the kind of authority that only comes from years of military training. "Stand back from the Queen's Guard," he commanded, his voice carrying with such force that tourists 50 yards away turned to look. The sound echoed off the palace walls, and the entire crowd fell into complete silence. The blonde woman stumbled backward, her phone nearly falling from her hands, her face going pale with shock. James's transformation was remarkable. One moment he had been a silent, motionless figure, and the next he was every inch the trained soldier he truly was. His eyes, which had been staring straight ahead, now focused directly on the woman with an intensity that made her take several more steps back. The crowd's reaction was immediate and varied. Many tourists began applauding, clearly pleased to see someone finally put the disrespectful group in their place. British visitors nodded with approval, while some international tourists looked shocked by the sudden change from silent statue to commanding military presence. The woman's friends, who had been laughing and recording just moments before, now stood frozen with their cameras still running, capturing their friend's humiliation. The blonde tourist herself looked around desperately, as if searching for support that was clearly not coming from the crowd that had gathered to watch her antics. James held his position for exactly the right amount of time, allowing his message to sink in completely before returning to his ceremonial stance. The movement back to stillness was just as precise as his initial reaction, demonstrating the complete control he maintained over every aspect of his behavior. Palace security moved closer to the group, their presence now obvious and threatening. The lead security officer, a stern-faced man in a dark suit, approached the blonde woman with the kind of walk that suggested she was about to receive a very serious conversation about appropriate behavior on royal grounds. The woman tried to laugh off the incident, looking around at the crowd as if expecting them to share in her amusement. Instead, she was met with stares of disapproval and disappointment. Several tourists shook their heads, and she could hear murmured comments about disrespectful Americans and inappropriate behavior. Her friends began suggesting they should leave the area immediately. The fun had clearly gone out of their palace visit, and they were starting to realize that their behavior might have consequences beyond just social embarrassment. The security officer was now standing directly in front of them, waiting for them to acknowledge his presence. James had returned to his perfect stillness, but the impact of his intervention lingered in the air. Other tourists who had been pushing boundaries suddenly stepped back to more respectful distances. Parents used the moment as a teaching opportunity, explaining to their children about the importance of showing respect for military personnel and national traditions. The blonde woman, still holding her phone, looked at the screen and realized that everything had been recorded. What had started as an attempt to create entertaining content for her social media followers had become documentation of her public humiliation. The video clearly showed her inappropriate behavior, followed by the guard's powerful response. She tried to approach James again, perhaps hoping to apologize or explain herself, but the security officer immediately stepped between them. His message was clear without him needing to say a word. Her interaction with the royal guard was over, and any further attempts to cause disruption would not be tolerated. The crowd began to disperse slightly, though many tourists continued to watch from a respectful distance, hoping to see if anything else would happen. The incident had become the highlight of many people's palace visit, and phones continued recording as the security team dealt with the disruptive group. James's demonstration had been perfect. He had shown exactly the right amount of force to make his point clear while maintaining the dignity and professionalism expected of the royal guard. His reaction had been textbook military response, swift, decisive, and completely appropriate to the situation. The security officer began speaking to the blonde woman in low, firm tones that the surrounding crowd couldn't quite hear, but his body language made it clear that this was not a friendly conversation. The woman's confident demeanor crumbled as she realized the serious nature of her situation. Her attempts to maintain a casual, dismissive attitude were clearly not working with the professional security personnel. Meanwhile, other tourists in the area began sharing their own recordings of the incident. Within minutes, multiple angles of James's powerful response were being uploaded to various social media platforms. Comments started flowing in immediately, with most viewers praising the royal guard's professional handling of the situation and criticizing the tourists' disrespectful behavior. The woman's friends grew increasingly uncomfortable as they noticed more phones pointed in their direction. What had started as their friend's quest for social media fame was rapidly becoming a viral sensation that painted them all in an extremely negative light. They began tugging at her arm, suggesting urgently that they should leave the palace grounds immediately. James remained at his post, completely motionless once again, but his presence now commanded a new level of respect from everyone in the area. Tourists who had been casually walking near the guards now maintained careful distances, and parents could be heard instructing their children about proper behavior around the Queen's Guard. The security officer finished his conversation with the disruptive group and made it clear that they needed to move away from the guard posts immediately. He escorted them toward the palace gates, ensuring they understood that their behavior had been unacceptable, and that continued disruption would result in their removal from the premises entirely. As the group walked away, the blonde woman could be seen checking her phone frantically, likely discovering that videos of her encounter were already spreading across social media platforms. Her expression grew increasingly distressed as she began to understand the scope of her public embarrassment. The crowd that had gathered to watch the incident began to disperse, but many tourists approached the area where James stood with newfound appreciation for the Royal Guard's role. They took photos from respectful distances, clearly understanding better than before that these were not costumed performers, but trained military personnel deserving of proper respect. An elderly British gentleman who had witnessed the entire incident approached the barrier near James's position. He stood quietly for a moment, then gave a small respectful nod toward the guard before walking away. It was a gesture that spoke volumes about the pride many Britons felt in their military traditions and their appreciation for James's professional response. Several international tourists who had observed the incident began asking questions about the Royal Guard's training and duties. Local visitors were happy to explain the history and significance of the Guards, turning the negative incident into an educational opportunity about British military tradition and the importance of showing proper respect. The palace tour guides, who had initially been concerned about the disruption, found themselves fielding more questions than usual about the Guards' roles and responsibilities. The incident had actually increased many tourists' interest in learning about the traditions they were witnessing, rather than just taking selfies with them. James could sense the changed atmosphere around his post. The respectful distance now, maintained by visitors, the quieter conversations, and the more thoughtful behavior, all indicated that his intervention had achieved its intended effect. The dignity of his position and the institution he represented had been preserved. As the morning progressed, news of the incident began spreading beyond just the immediate social media posts. Travel bloggers who had witnessed the event started writing about the importance of respecting local customs and traditions when visiting historical sites. The story was becoming a teachable moment about cultural sensitivity and appropriate tourist behavior. The blonde woman and her friends had completely disappeared from the palace grounds, but their brief presence had created lasting impact. Other potential troublemakers in the crowd had clearly received the message that disrespectful behavior would not be tolerated, and the overall atmosphere around the guard posts had become more reverent and appropriate. Within hours, the video footage of James's commanding response had exploded across the internet. The incident was shared thousands of times on various social media platforms, with viewers from around the world commenting on the professionalism displayed by the Royal Guard and expressing shock at the tourists' inappropriate behavior. News outlets began picking up the story, with headlines praising the Guard's measured but firm response to disrespectful tourists. The videos were featured on morning television shows, travel programs, and news websites across multiple countries. James had unknowingly become an international symbol of military professionalism and dignity. The blonde tourist, meanwhile, was experiencing the harsh reality of internet fame for all the wrong reasons. Her social media accounts were flooded with negative comments from viewers who had seen the palace incident. People from her hometown began recognizing her from the viral videos, and she found herself facing consequences she had never anticipated when she decided to harass the Royal Guard. Travel forums and websites started using the incident as a prime example of how not to behave when visiting historical sites and interacting with military personnel. Tourism boards from various countries began sharing the video as part of educational campaigns about respectful travel behavior and cultural sensitivity. James's fellow guards and military colleagues expressed pride in his handling of the situation. His response had been textbook perfect, exactly the kind of measured professional reaction that their training was designed to produce. He had demonstrated that Royal Guards were not just ceremonial figures, but skilled soldiers capable of maintaining order when necessary. The palace administration received hundreds of supportive messages praising James's actions and expressing appreciation for the royal guard's dedication to their duties. Many visitors shared stories of their own positive experiences at the palace, contrasting them with the disrespectful behavior they had witnessed in the viral video. Educational institutions began using the incident in their discussions about appropriate behavior, military respect, and the consequences of social media actions. The video became a case study in how quickly inappropriate behavior could be broadcast to a global audience, and the lasting impact such actions could have on someone's reputation. The Women's University, which had been identified through social media detective work by internet users, faced questions about their students' behavior abroad. This added another layer of consequences for the blonde tourist, as her actions now reflected not just on herself, but on her educational institution and her home country. Tourism officials in London noted an interesting side effect of the viral incident. Many international visitors began approaching Royal Guard posts with notably more respectful behavior, and there was an increase in tourists asking questions about proper etiquette when visiting palace grounds. The incident had inadvertently created a teaching moment for millions of travelers worldwide. James continued his regular duties, unaware of the global attention his response had generated. Royal Guards are typically not informed about media coverage of their actions, as maintaining focus on their duties is considered more important than dealing with public attention. The security team at Buckingham Palace reported a significant decrease in inappropriate tourist behavior in the days following the incident. Word had clearly spread among visitors that disrespectful actions would be met with swift, professional responses, and the overall atmosphere around the palace had become more reverent and appropriate. Mental health professionals began commenting on the incident as well, discussing the psychological impact of viral shame and the importance of considering long-term consequences before engaging in attention-seeking behavior. The blonde tourist's experience became a cautionary tale about the permanent nature of internet content and the importance of respectful behavior. International military personnel and veterans expressed solidarity with James, sharing their own experiences of maintaining professionalism in the face of public disrespect. The incident had sparked a broader conversation about the treatment of service members and the importance of showing proper respect for military traditions worldwide. 6 months after the incident, the impact of James's response continued to resonate around the world. The video had been viewed millions of times and had become one of the most shared examples of professional military bearing under pressure. Travel guidebooks began including sections about appropriate behavior around Royal Guards, using the incident as a reference point. The blonde tourist, whose name had eventually been discovered by internet users, faced long-lasting consequences for her 15 minutes of negative fame. Her social media presence never recovered from the backlash, and she was forced to delete most of her accounts and retreat from public online activity. Job interviews became difficult as employers would often find the viral video when searching her name. James, meanwhile, received official recognition from his superiors for his exemplary handling of the situation. While Royal Guards rarely receive public acknowledgement for individual actions, his response was held up internally as a perfect example of how to maintain dignity while addressing disruptive behavior. He was promoted within the Guard Regiment, a reflection of the respect he had earned from his peers and commanders. The incident led to changes in palace security protocols and tourist management. Additional signage was installed explaining the role and importance of the Royal Guards, and security personnel received enhanced training in managing social media-driven inappropriate behavior. The goal was to prevent similar situations while maintaining the accessibility that made the palace a popular tourist destination. Tourism statistics showed an interesting trend in the months following the viral video. While overall visitor numbers to Buckingham Palace remained steady, there was a marked improvement in visitor behavior and a decrease in incidents requiring security intervention. The global attention had effectively educated millions of potential tourists about appropriate conduct. Educational institutions around the world began incorporating the incident into their curricula about digital citizenship, cultural respect, and the permanent nature of online content. The story became a powerful teaching tool about how momentary lapses in judgment could have lasting consequences in the age of social media and viral content. The woman eventually issued a public apology, acknowledging her inappropriate behavior and expressing regret for her actions. However, the apology came too late to prevent most of the negative consequences she had experienced, and it received far less attention than the original incident. The internet rarely forgets, and her moment of poor judgment had become permanently associated with her identity. James continued his distinguished service with the Royal Guards, eventually becoming a training instructor who used his own experience to teach new recruits about maintaining professionalism under pressure. His response to the disruptive tourist became part of the training curriculum, showing future guards exactly how to handle similar situations with appropriate force and dignity. The incident also sparked broader discussions about tourist behavior at historical and cultural sites worldwide. Other countries with ceremonial military units reported improvements in visitor conduct, suggesting that the lesson learned at Buckingham Palace had global implications for respectful tourism. Years later, the video continued to circulate as new generations discovered it and shared it with friends. It had become a timeless example of the importance of respecting military personnel and cultural traditions, regardless of one's nationality or background. The incident served as a permanent reminder that actions have consequences, especially in an interconnected world where inappropriate behavior can be instantly broadcast to millions. The blonde tourist never fully escaped the shadow of her viral moment, but she eventually used her experience to advocate for digital literacy and respectful travel behavior. Her hard-learned lesson about the permanence of internet content and the importance of cultural sensitivity became a cautionary tale that helped educate others about the responsibilities that come with traveling to foreign countries and interacting with their institutions. James's perfect response had not only addressed an immediate situation, but had created lasting positive change in how tourists approach one of Britain's most important cultural sites. His split-second decision to act with firm professionalism had protected the dignity of an institution while teaching millions of people worldwide about respect, consequences, and the importance of appropriate behavior in any situation.